There's a version of Hollywood you were never supposed to see. The version that exists after the cameras stop rolling, after the applause fades, and after the makeup gets wiped away. For 30 years, Johnny Carson sat across from the biggest names on the planet every single night, and he smiled, he laughed, he played the gracious host. But there's something nobody ever told you about the man behind the desk. He was watching, he was cataloging, and he was keeping score. Now, long after the spotlight moved on, Carson sat alone on his yacht off the coast of Catalina Island, the Pacific stretching out endlessly before him, and he finally decided to crack open the darkest file he ever kept. Not the file of people he admired, the file of people who made him sick. 7 of them, to be exact. 7 men that America placed on pedestals so high that questioning them felt almost criminal. But Johnny Carson questioned all of them. And what he found underneath the polish and the charm and the tailored suits would make you rethink everything you thought you knew about the golden age of entertainment. This isn't gossip. This isn't speculation. This is the cold, unvarnished truth from the one man who saw these legends up close, night after night, without the safety net of a script. So sit back, because once you hear what Carson had to say about these 7 men, you will never look at them the same way again. The first name that rose to the surface of Carson's memory was Frank Sinatra, and it rose with the weight of years of swallowed frustration. To the rest of the world, Sinatra was untouchable. He was elegance personified, a man whose voice could silence a room, and whose presence commanded reverence. But the moment Frank Sinatra stepped into the Tonight Show studio, the entire atmosphere shifted from a place of entertainment into something that felt far closer to a royal court where the king had just walked in and nobody dared breathe wrong. Carson recalled that Sinatra always arrived with an entourage that functioned less like a support team and more like a security detail for a mob boss. Every member of the staff knew the rules before Sinatra even opened his mouth. No personal questions. No references to anything that might embarrass him. No jokes that strayed even slightly from what Frank had pre-approved. And if Carson dared to slip even once, even with the smallest wink of humor that caught Sinatra off guard, the man would fix him with a stare so cold and so threatening that Carson, a seasoned professional who had hosted millions of Americans for decades, would feel the air leave his lungs. But it wasn't how Sinatra treated his fellow stars that carved the deepest scar in Carson's memory. It was how he treated the people nobody ever saw, the lighting technicians, the makeup artists, the runners who fetched coffee and held clipboards and made the whole machine work. Carson never forgot watching Sinatra verbally destroy a young lighting technician because the kid had accidentally nudged a light stand near where Frank was sitting. There was no warning. There was no calm correction. Sinatra unleashed the most humiliating language Carson had ever heard directed at someone who had done nothing more than make an honest mistake, and he did it in front of the entire crew. That, Carson said, was the moment he truly understood what Frank Sinatra was. Not the gentleman the world celebrated, but a man who used his power like a weapon against anyone who couldn't fight back. The demands never stopped either. Carson remembered a night when Sinatra ordered the entire studio lighting rig to be overhauled minutes before the cameras were supposed to roll, simply because he felt the current setup was highlighting his wrinkles. Dozens of people scrambled, worked themselves to exhaustion, and not a single please or thank you ever left Sinatra's lips. He treated their labor as his birthright. Carson also observed something darker in Sinatra, a pattern of loyalty manipulation that bordered on predatory. Frank could embrace you as a brother one day, and the moment you stepped out of line, even in the smallest way, he would quietly activate every connection he had in Hollywood to make sure your career withered. The space around Frank Sinatra was never warm. It was a space built on submission and fear, and Carson watched colleague after colleague bend silently rather than risk the chairman's wrath. Carson concluded that Frank Sinatra carried the most beautiful voice anyone had ever heard, but underneath that gift lived a petty, controlling soul that dragged everyone around him down. The second name on Carson's list was Jerry Lewis, and if Sinatra was a cold and calculated storm, Jerry Lewis was an uncontrollable wildfire that burned everything in its path. On screen, Jerry was a genius. His physical comedy was the kind of rare, almost supernatural talent that could reduce an entire theater to helpless laughter. But the instant the studio lights went dark, that lovable, funny man evaporated, replaced by a grumpy, self-absorbed dictator who looked at the people around him as though they existed solely to serve his ego. Carson recalled that every time Jerry Lewis's name appeared on the Tonight Show schedule, the staff felt a wave of quiet dread wash over them. Jerry never entered the green room with a smile or a friendly word. He walked in as though he owned every inch of the building, and everyone in it was just cheap furniture arranged for his convenience. He would berate subordinates for the most trivial things imaginable, bringing the wrong type of coffee or positioning a chair a few inches off from where he wanted it. And he would do it with a viciousness that left people shaken. What made Carson feel truly sick about Jerry Lewis, though, wasn't the tantrums or the demands. It was the hypocrisy. For decades, Jerry Lewis was the face of televised charity, standing before cameras with tears in his eyes, raising money and awareness for disabled children. He was celebrated as a man of enormous compassion. But Carson witnessed the flip side of that performance firsthand. The moment the cameras turned off and the audience applause faded, Jerry Lewis would use cruel, derogatory language about the very people he had just spent hours pretending to care deeply about. Carson couldn't wrap his mind around how someone could maintain that kind of double life so seamlessly, wearing the mask of sainthood in public while rotting with contempt in private. There was also the incident Carson never forgot, when Jerry Lewis demanded that a costume designer be fired on the spot because she had accidentally wrinkled the hem of his jacket. Carson personally stepped in to save the young woman's job, and Jerry repaid that intervention with years of cold, simmering hostility. To Jerry Lewis, other people's dignity simply did not exist if it stood between him and his idea of perfection. Carson watched Jerry crush young comedians, mock their material in rooms where everyone could hear, and isolate anyone who dared to shine as brightly as he did. Carson believed a true comedian should bring joy into the world, and Jerry Lewis, for all his brilliance, brought mostly fear and resentment to the people closest to him. The third figure on Carson's mental list was Milton Berle, the man television itself had made famous, and the man Carson came to view as the most shameless thief the entertainment industry ever produced. Milton Berle earned the title of Mr. Television because millions of American families bought their first television sets in the late 1940s just to watch him perform. He was a giant, but to Carson that giant was built on a foundation of stolen light. Milton Berle's central problem was that he could never accept being just one voice in a room. He needed to be the only voice, the loudest voice, and he would go to extraordinary lengths to make sure of it. Every time Milton appeared on The Tonight Show, Carson felt less like a host conducting an interview and more like a man trying to survive a one-man wrecking ball. Milton never listened. He walked into the studio with an enormous cigar clamped between his teeth and a mouth that simply never stopped moving. He interrupted constantly, hijacked other guests' stories, stole punchlines before they landed, and turned every segment into an unsolicited one-man show that served no one but himself. The nickname Hollywood gave Milton, the joke thief, was one Carson confirmed was entirely deserved. Milton had a habit that Carson found genuinely disturbing. He would seek out young, emerging comedians, watch their sets, write down their best material, and then perform those exact bits on national television as though he had created them himself. Carson witnessed young comedians crying backstage after watching their hardest-worked routines disappear into Milton's act without so much as an acknowledgement. To Carson, that wasn't just poor professional ethics. It was the act of a man so desperate to remain relevant that he was willing to destroy the futures of people who had done nothing to him. Milton's ego extended into every corner of his behavior. He barged into other guests' dressing rooms without knocking, invaded their preparation time to deliver unsolicited monologues about his own career highlights, and treated every person in the building as a captive audience whether they wanted to be or not. Carson once had to personally escort Milton out of a makeup room because the man was disrupting an actress who was preparing for an emotionally demanding scene. Milton Berle, Carson concluded, was a man so terrified of being forgotten that his greed for attention turned him rude, thieving, and ultimately isolated from the very industry he had once helped build. The fourth name on Carson's list carried a different kind of poison. This wasn't a man who stole jokes or demanded worship. This was a man whose entire identity was built on a false image of masculinity. And beneath that image lived someone Carson could only describe as deeply contemptuous of women. That man was Burt Reynolds. In the 1970s, Burt Reynolds was arguably the biggest movie star on the planet. His mustache, his smirk, his effortless swagger made him the icon of rugged American charm, and his appearances on The Tonight Show were always among the most watched. But Carson saw through the performance faster than almost anyone. Reynolds walked into every room as though the air itself owed him gratitude for being breathed. His vanity about his appearance was almost comical in its intensity. He would spend enormous stretches of time forcing makeup artists to adjust every strand of hair, obsessing over his toupee with a sensitivity so extreme that if anyone even hinted they knew he was wearing one, Reynolds would turn aggressive and cruel in an instant. But Carson's deepest disgust with Reynolds centered on how he treated women. Whenever an attractive female guest appeared on the same show, Reynolds saw not a colleague but an accessory, something to be displayed, objectified, and made the subject of crude jokes for his own amusement. Carson watched Reynolds make unwanted physical contact and deliver leering comments to female guests right in front of the backstage crew, leaving women feeling humiliated and unsafe. Carson had to steer conversations away from Reynolds' behavior repeatedly to protect the dignity of the women sitting across from him. And when Reynolds was asked questions in interviews, he didn't really listen. He simply waited for the pause so he could launch into elaborate tales about his romantic conquests, delivered with a self-satisfaction that Carson found nauseating. Reynolds treated the women in his life as trophies, as stories to tell, as proof of his own greatness, and he never once seemed to consider that any of them might have feelings worth acknowledging. Carson remembered a moment on live television when Reynolds dumped an entire can of whipped cream on another guest for a cheap laugh. The audience roared. But Carson saw the flash of genuine anger and humiliation cross the person's face, and backstage, Reynolds offered no apology. He called it art. That casual disregard for anyone else's experience, Carson felt, was the truest version of Burt Reynolds. The fifth name was perhaps the most exhausting one Carson had to discuss, not because of anger or cruelty, but because of a suffocating, deliberate coldness that made every single interaction feel like pulling teeth. That was Charles Bronson. On screen, Bronson was magnificent. The man radiated danger and quiet authority in a way few actors ever matched. But Carson made clear that the stone-faced intensity Bronson projected on camera was not acting. It was how he actually treated every human being he encountered in real life, and it made him the most difficult guest The Tonight Show ever hosted. Bronson never viewed appearing on television as a privilege or even a simple professional obligation. He treated it as a favor he was granting, and he wanted everyone in the room to know it. When Carson asked him questions, genuinely crafted questions designed to draw out interesting stories or insights, Bronson responded with monosyllables. Yes, no, sometimes nothing at all, just a long, uncomfortable silence and a look that suggested Carson was wasting his time. Carson described the feeling of interviewing Bronson as one of the most professionally humiliating experiences of his career, not because Bronson was hostile in an obvious way, but because his contempt was so silent and so absolute that it poisoned the entire studio. Backstage, the coldness was even sharper. Bronson never greeted a single person, from the most senior producer to the newest assistant. He swept through the halls with a look of disdain that made staff members physically uncomfortable. Carson recalled a young female crew member who was brought to tears, simply because Bronson refused to engage with a basic polite question and responded with such contemptuous dismissal that it felt like a slap. Carson believed that true strength never required cruelty toward people who were simply trying to do their jobs. He also noticed that Bronson seemed to genuinely despise the audience, the very people whose ticket purchases and television ratings made his career possible. He never smiled at them, never waved, never acknowledged their existence with anything resembling warmth. Carson eventually came to understand that Bronson's rudeness was less about confidence and more about a deep insecurity, a need to appear dangerous and untouchable, because the alternative, being seen as an ordinary person capable of vulnerability, was something Bronson simply could not face. The sixth name brought Carson not dread or exhaustion, but a sharp, satisfying sense of justice. That name was Chevy Chase. When Chase burst onto the scene with Saturday Night Live, he carried himself with the kind of arrogance that made even other arrogant people uncomfortable. He walked into the Tonight Show studio not as a guest, but as someone who believed he was conferring an honor on the show simply by showing up. Carson recalled hearing Chase tear apart the looks, abilities, and character of stagehands and crew members with a viciousness that shocked even the most hardened Hollywood veterans. Chase genuinely believed he was the only truly talented person in any room he entered, and he made sure everyone around him felt that belief in their bones. But the moment that defined Chase in Carson's memory wasn't any single interview. It was the spectacular, public collapse of Chase's own late-night talk show, launched with enormous fanfare and the bold prediction that Chase would redefine television and dethrone Carson himself. Carson allowed himself a rare, visible smirk when recalling what happened next. The show cratered almost immediately. The ratings were abysmal. The crew was miserable. And Chase's behavior toward the people working to make the show function was so toxic that the whole enterprise was canceled within weeks. Carson admitted openly that when he heard the news, he felt a deep, uncomplicated satisfaction. Not out of jealousy, but out of a profound belief that the universe had delivered exactly the lesson Chase deserved. Fame, Carson observed, is not a shield. When you spend it trampling others, it will eventually come back and swallow you whole. Chase's downfall was the clearest proof of that Carson had ever witnessed. The final name on Carson's list was the one that disturbed him most deeply, not because of loud aggression or obvious cruelty, but because of a deception so perfectly constructed that it fooled an entire nation for decades. That man was Bill Cosby. To America, Bill Cosby was the gold standard of fatherhood, warmth, and moral authority. Dr. Huxtable in his colorful sweaters, dispensing gentle wisdom to his television family, while millions of real families gathered around their sets and absorbed every word. Carson knew better. He had watched Cosby up close, interview after interview, and what he saw behind those warm eyes was something that made his skin crawl. The moment the on-air lights switched off, Cosby's famous gentle smile would vanish with a speed that startled people who witnessed it for the first time, replaced by a cold, calculating expression that bore no resemblance to the man America thought it knew. Cosby's particular brand of toxicity, Carson explained, was rooted in an unshakable belief that he was morally superior to every person around him, and that it was his duty to make them feel it. He wandered backstage like a self-appointed inspector, criticizing a cameraman's clothing, commenting on an assistant's appearance, raising his voice to lecture a writer about how they should be living their life. He dispensed unsolicited moral corrections to anyone within earshot, wrapping his condescension in the language of wisdom and guidance. Carson found the atmosphere Cosby created suffocating, a constant haze of judgment that made people feel they were always being evaluated and found wanting. What haunted Carson most, though, was his own gut instinct about the man. Carson wrote that every time he looked into Cosby's eyes, he didn't see kindness, he saw calculation. The speeches about clean living, family values, and moral responsibility sounded hollow to Carson, like lines rehearsed to cover something underneath that couldn't bear to be seen. Carson recalled an incident where Cosby berated a staff member for laughing too loudly during a break, using heavy moralistic language to crush the person's spirit in the name of professionalism. Carson intervened, and the look Cosby gave him in return was not embarrassment or remorse. It was hostility, quiet and cold, the look of a man who believed no one had the authority to challenge him. As dawn broke over Catalina Island, and the sea turned from black to deep purple. Johnny Carson closed his notebook for the last time. He had named them all. 7 men the world had worshipped, 7 men he had spent decades sitting across from, and 7 men whose true characters had been hidden behind layers of charm, talent, and public image so convincing that questioning them felt almost dangerous. Carson understood that glamour could deceive for a long time, but he also understood that time and the truth always catch up. The men on his list were not monsters with fangs and claws. They were something quieter and in many ways more unsettling. They were ordinary people, gifted and powerful, who had chosen to let their worst instincts go unchecked because no one around them had the courage or the authority to stop them. Carson set down his glass, looked out at the water, and felt lighter than he had in years.